Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Katrina Rogers. Katrina is the president of Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara, California. Katrina is joining us on the podcast to chat about the book, Democracy, Civic Engagement, and Citizenship in Higher Education, Reclaiming Our Civic Purpose. The book was published in 2019 by Lexington Press and was edited by Katrina and William Flores and includes the writings of more than 20 university and college presidents. Katrina, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Katrina, I have to say this book, Democracy, Civic Engagement, Citizenship, and Higher Education, it is like the perfect book for the times we are living in. We are in the midst of an election cycle. We are also, for the spirit of full disclosure to our audience, we are in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, and dialogue and how we solve problems and come together as a community in this country are of paramount importance. So I would love, just to learn more about you and, what was the spark that where you and your peer said, we need to write a book about this topic. So let's start about you first. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Life is so interesting, Howard. I find that only in retrospect do you look back on your life and you see a pattern. And while you're in it, you don't necessarily see that pattern. I think I became very interested in democracy at an early age. So long before I went into higher education as a professional and long before I became a university president, I was always intrigued by the notion that if you as an individual, if you could figure out how to act and turn a lever on a system, you could make change happen. I think it started when I was actually quite a young woman during 1976. During the bicentennial, and I was still in grammar school, but I remember the excitement and the energy around all the bicentennial celebrations going on around the country. And that was my first notion that we as people are linked to a government we were calling democratic, calling democracy with a small d. And it really activated me because it got me thinking about the role of government and the role of good government and the role of us as citizens. And sort of bracket that, went on in my life, got educated. I ended up working in the nonprofit sector and conservation for many years. And I found myself matriculating back into higher education now as a leader, as a university leader. And I've been at Fielding Graduate University for 15 years and the last 7 as its president. And the more that I have been engaged in leadership, the more that I have seen higher education in particular as maybe unique in being one of the sectors, the only sector that I can think of, that has the duty and the moral responsibility to be in asking of our young people more than simply getting educated, that we have opportunities to ask young people the kinds of questions that challenge them and help them grow into what does it mean to be a citizen. And that idea of citizen, which you can take that notion and just see it from very many different facets, some positive, some not so. It's a social construct, right? It's a term, if you will. But that notion of citizen really underpins the ability for any government to truly be a healthy one and to be a truly democratic one.
To think about ourselves or whether we are young kids, and I would imagine there's a limit to how a child, a young grammar school kid, a high school kid can think about themselves as citizens unless we are educated either by our parents, our community, our teachers. Is the role of civics, does that still have a place in school so that we start to get the basics, the basis, for who we are hopefully going to become? Is that still in play, for kids? Are they learning about what it means to become a future citizen?
Yeah, great question. It's some really solid research from political scientists as well as from the Kettering Foundation, who conducts a lot of research on civic engagement across the spectrum of the whole entire population. One of the interesting findings is that, yes, civics matters in the classroom from a very young age up through high school and then into college, but also family. It's the family. And I would ask you yourself, Howard, think about the first time, or how old were you when you first thought about voting? Did somebody teach you? Was it a teacher? Was it your parents? Were there voting booths in your grammar school? Did you learn about it? How did that shape your understanding of you yourself having some kind of agency? And I think that we know that the family is very important in terms of the generational transfer of citizenship, as well as schools. So I would say that they have to interact together. Some researchers have looked at the decline of civics as a formal subject in the classroom from K to 12 and then beyond. And indeed, that has had a deleterious impact on citizen engagement, because there has been a diminution of what it means to be a citizen. It has been reduced to someone voting, as opposed to someone really active in their local community or in politics or in writing letters to their congressman and lobbying or collective action for some greater public good.
You know, I remember growing up and if going to my local elementary school, because that's where my parents went to vote. I remember going with them. I remember the big voting booth with the curtain and the little levers. I remember that. I remember the lawn signs that would show up a couple times a year or every couple years, 2 years, 4 years. I remember probably when I was 13, 14, Nixon-Humphrey. I think it was Nixon-Humphrey election. And I remember I must have learned something in school, because I remember I'm voting for Richard Nixon and just is stating that. Now, I have no idea why I said it, but I it's one of those childhood memories that I've carried with me. And I remember, just people coming to our door, knocking on our door, canvassing. And even as I grew older, I did it. I would walk down the street in a neighborhood here in Chicago and, are you going to go out and vote? And it's almost as though, our elders, people that are in my elder parents or grandparents' age, they're the ones that are staffing the precincts, when it's time to vote. I don't see a lot of younger people out there. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe on a university campus if there's a precinct nearby. But do you have a sense that as we are getting older, that late teens, early in the 20s, college-age kids, are they more involved? Or are they taking the course because it's a prerequisite? And then, okay, I'm done. I'm going to take my major courses in math and science, engineering. Are they learning more?
It's part of the zeitgeist that we have an assumption that younger people are checked out or not interested, disengaged from democracy or democratic traditions. And at the same time, we can see some evidence for that. If you look at voting patterns, for instance, it's clear that people who are older tend to vote. They feel more vested in the system. They have more experience. I would say that voting, like any other active citizen engagement, is often somewhat developmental. That is, it is the case that as we mature, so there's one facet of it, that is, as we get older into our 20s and 30s, we see a more expansive view of the world. That just tends to be the case. And that's, normally, usually, generally, not casting any aspersions on that. I think that's very true. It's true for me. It's true for many people as they go through their life experience. As they accumulate life experience, they get more connected to community ideas. I think there's another piece, though, here that's important. I would say that young people are not disengaged at all. I think they're differently engaged. And a shout out to my co-authors who are campus-based presidents, and as you know, Fielding is not, that campus-based presidents really see a lot of action and a lot of good thinking and commitment and passion to different ideas, not all the same, right? but that these represent democratic ideals. So I think there's a different kind of engagement that generations take on, right? As media changes, as technology changes, as communication changes, as our understanding of democracy changes. And there's a wonderful historian, Will and Ariel Durant. They published together, and they were a pair, and they talk about how each generation has to claim the kind of society they want for their generation. And I would adapt that to be each generation has to claim democracy. And that's what you're always going to see, because it is something that you have to work on in order to make it real and in order for it to survive.
This idea of, each generation has to claim their place and figure out what is it that I need to do to stay engaged and to kind of be a part of the community, help to grow the community. How did this book then start to come about? Because, I think on the negative side, every once in a while, maybe from certain news venues, education is a bad thing. There's a confusion, I think, between democracy and being a Democrat or liberal. I think universities are places of learning to learn how to critically do research, have dialogue, critical thinking. And there's a stream out there that basically says, oh, you don't need to do that anymore. And I look at this book then as an opportunity to say, no, our universities are the perfect place to teach people how to have a role in democracy, have a role in civic engagement, and to be a part of the community. So how did this book then start to go from just an idea, a thought maybe, to becoming a full-fledged text, to be used out in the university environment?
There's no question the last 8 years or so, democracy, and I say small d, meaning democracy writ large as a concept not associated with the Democratic Party, has been under threat or has been perceived to be under threat, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And the argument is, if you read Joe Lepore's work in The New Yorker just recently, The Last Time Democracy Almost Died, she pulls together a great deal of research in her narrative that there are these waves across societies that we've seen in the last century where you get these strong rises in populism. Populism tends to be antithetical to democracy, not always, but it tends to be because it tends to give rise to authoritarian regimes. And you could see this in the 20s in Central Europe. You could see it all over the world by the late 30s. And it was part of the spark of World War II. And there are those that make the same parallel, and in fact, in my chapter in this book, I talk about this, that there are so many big structural forces that societies are enduring, trying to process, trying to reconcile into what does their society mean. These forces are globalization and the acceleration of technological innovation. Those are the two forces that really are driving a lot of the changes in how we even view what a democracy is for and whether it has any purpose at all. And populist movements often come from fear, because it's an uncertain time and it's hard to know what the future is going to be. And it's largely unwritten. It's, of course, unwritten. And the challenge is often in those kinds of movements, they hearken back to some glorious age, which really never was, but it is an ideal of what they'd like society to be, what we'd like society to be. They can be very powerful movements for people because they seem to offer an answer during a time of great uncertainty. Arguably, humanity has never confronted something this, I don't know if I'd say catastrophic, as this is the first time humanity, with our communications ability, our technological ability, and the way that we've woven the world together through trade and commerce, that we are confronting something completely to a scale that humanity's never had to before, clearly. And I know you're going to ask me about COVID-19 later, but I'd say now this is another example. I mean, the pandemic is a perfect example of the intertwining and calling into question what is government for, right? And it's a great question.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were sharing that, I was thinking Yeah, this is a perfect segue for the COVID-19 because it opens up a lot of uncertainty about who our leaders are, what they're doing, how are they helping to keep me safe and secure. And, so as this threat from these populist forces are present, along comes this little COVID-19 to me is an equalizer. Doesn't matter how much money you make, where you live, it's going to affect us all. Now, it may affect certain socioeconomic and racial populations a little differently, but it's affecting us all. And I think, do you have a sense that because of this virus, like the conversations that this book would hopefully allow us to have in our classrooms? Because, there's 20 some chapters. Each chapter has a unique spin to it. Yours, higher education response, well, that was the introduction. Higher education response to new crisis in democracy. Your chapter, technology, inequality, and globalization, considerations for leaders in a democratic society. That I could see that is your place in this text, but all these chapters speak to a different aspect of, the democracy, engagement, higher education. Do you have a sense that the conversations coming out of this virus are going to be maybe front and center within these universities and colleges?
Oh, I do. I wanted to go back to your earlier question to answer this one, which is, what was the motivation behind the book? The Kettering Foundation, whose mission is how to make democracy work as it should, has been convening a group of college presidents and university presidents these past few years. And we meet and have conversations. What are we seeing on our campuses? What are some of the big challenges? Particularly, what's been on the minds of college and university presidents these past 4 years since the 2016 election is the continuing polarization. It's happening before, clearly, but the continuing polarization and inability to talk across difference or feel like you can respect difference, whether that's political differences, racial, whatever they are, religious, and so on, that we're getting more and more into separate tracks where we only talk to people like ourselves who think the same things we do. And that's in itself an existential threat to democratic ideals, right? Of consensus, negotiation, collaboration, collective action. So as we gathered, we thought, but there are really good examples of work going on all across the nation in colleges and universities, and we should talk about those and we should share them. So when you read the individual chapters, and really a shout out to my great co-authors, they talk about, at a land grant, how does this work? How are they thinking about strengthening civic engagement? And remember, it's not about indoctrinating or inculcating, young people with a certain view of the world. It's meant to be helping people become critical thinkers, questioning assumptions, asking critical questions, navigating across difference. How do I talk to someone who doesn't agree with me politically? Truth is, we can all use this, right? I'm sure we can all feel like we've been in conversations we didn't know how to get out of or didn't know how to move forward. And these are the kinds of things that presidents are taking up. Another one is free speech. As you know, big conversations and violent demonstrations on college campuses about what constitutes free speech, what's free, what's hate speech. These are really important. These are the central conversations of our time. So how does this relate to the pandemic? Well, the pandemic is another third, I'd say, kind of external stressor that where you need to be able to assemble large amounts of data, think critically about it, question your assumptions to figure out what decisions do you make in a time of uncertainty. And you can see, I think after this pandemic is over, and this may become episodic, may become more routine as we're in a world of growing population and more animal-human interface, more likely to happen possibly. If you see, as a society adjusts, there's going to be research for years to come, because what you're going to see is where were the regimes, when I say regimes, where were the frameworks where, like, this county did that, and that state did that, and that state did that. What were the results? And how was the citizenry engaged, right? So I think it's going to be really interesting to unpack that. Like, were the citizens of Minnesota different than the ones in Wisconsin? The ones in Louisiana, the ones in California, the ones, and I'm not thinking along ideological lines. I'm thinking along almost a kind of cultural line. And can we actually take that as a window on the world for democracy in those places? I think it'll be very interesting to study.
Very interesting. And let's take COVID off of the table. I mean, we're heading into the election season. Well, we are in the election season. What am I saying? In a couple months, we're going to have a presidential election. How do your co-authors in this book? What are some of the techniques, styles, processes, ideas? How can we chip away at that polarization so that we can learn to come back, listen to understand, have a dialogue, and try to understand the other person's view without saying, you're wrong, I'm right. And how does that happen not only in the university setting, college setting, the campus setting, but also in the community? Because I think this book is not only perfect for the higher education, but it's also perfect for the community that needs to come to grips. So how can we bring people together?
There are two pieces to this. The first is expectation, and the second is skill sets. So in terms of expectations, one of the things education can do is, first of all, pose good questions. Not necessarily have all the answers, but pose questions that help students think more deeply about their own answers and help teach them how to pose questions as well. So one of the expectations I think that educators can set is that we live in an ambiguous, uncertain world. And in order to build one's own resilience, we also need to build a flexible mindset, a flexible and open mindset. And if we could move our students in that direction, they'll do much better over their lifetime. They just will. I mean, the research is solid on this. So that's expectations. The world is not certain. It's not black and white. It's not categorical. It's nuanced, ambiguous, and we can help you get there. And that's a kind of skill set. And there are ways to, certainly there are pedagogical techniques to do exactly that. The second is skill sets on the side of you can help people practice dialogue. And you can actually put people in a classroom or on a virtual setting and actually teach deliberation, dialogue and deliberation. Fielding Graduate University had a certificate for many years called Dialogue, Deliberation, and Public Engagement. Before I was president, I was faculty, and I did a lot of virtual training on being a moderator, on how do you host a dialogue, how do you engage in the dialogue, what does success look like. And these are skill sets. And so we know what we need to do and what can be done, and it is absolutely nonpartisan. There's a really good group that came up after the 2016 presidential election, and it's called, and you probably know it, Angels of Our Better Nature. And this is a nonprofit organization that puts people in the room that are polar opposites on the political spectrum and along the continuum, and they learn to talk to each other. And it's fairly profound because it turns out we have more things in common than we have not in common. And if people can move to a frame of listen and observe, then people start hearing each other in a completely different way.
Our education system below the high school level, there's a lot of focus on graduating, getting people into colleges, universities for STEM-related careers, technology, engineering, etc., mathematics. Is there do you have a sense that these types of skill sets that you just described, practicing dialogue and expectations, this nuanced type of dialogue, that we need to perhaps go back and refocus some of our efforts in education to develop those skills earlier, or does it happen at the university college level?
I'm an advocate that the earlier that a person can learn these skills, the stronger they'll be going through college. I'm also an advocate of the notion that you can do these things and teach content expertise. In other words, it's about how you teach the content. It doesn't have to be rote learning, for instance. And there's a great deal of innovation and creativity in K through 8 and K through 12. these days, that we interweave these kinds of content areas with these kinds of skill sets so that students are learning as they go. Having said that, though, they can be learned at any time in one's life, and they don't even have to be learned in a formal setting. I mean, certainly there are many, many people that don't have the opportunity or can't avail themselves of the opportunity to go to college that, are quite sophisticated in thinking and so on. But the thing is, when you're an educator, if you're a college university president, you're in the sector, you can promote this at your university. You know that you can really be an advocate and a stalwart supporter of these democratic ideals. I think, though, there is another piece of it, and goes back to what I said way at the beginning. It's not just about education, it's also about family and that generational transfer of knowledge, family or community or friends. I think it's important that we also help each other so we can do that in more informal settings. And I think that's also a very important part of democracy, which is the way that it's the way that you and I engage with each other too, not just what I may learn or what my parents taught me, but it's all of us together, which comes to mind in Tom Brokaws' book, The Greatest Generation. He talks about, his argument is that basically that was a generation, World War II generation, that forged a common bond. And since so many people were in the war directly, men and women, and everyone was affected indirectly, that after the war, there was much more of a sense of we're in this together, and there was multilateral institutions that were formed right after the war for world trade. There's the Fulbright program that was global, the Peace Corps a little later. There was still that whole generation had this notion of we may be different in the political spectrum, but we are, at the end of the day, we're all trying to make progress, right? We're all trying to get to some common goal. And his argument was that, and others have taken this up as well, that generation, when they were in Congress, they may disagree and they may be vociferous in some of their disagreements, but ultimately they compromised. And that's something that the next generation lost. That common bond that World War II created for that generation was lost in successive ones, which a larger generation, much bigger, much different, and more diverse set of experiences. The center was changing. Lots of other things were going on, clearly, civil rights, women's rights, etc. But that created a kind of diffusion. And some have argued that that's why this work is so important to make explicit, because that's the only way to break through. And you can break through in education, you can break through in work. Those are two experiences that are most common to people.
I would be curious whether the COVID-19 crisis could be one of those significant events that will prompt us to go back and look at who we are as individuals, as community, what kind of decisions do we make or have to make, so that maybe we might not be able to prevent the next pandemic, but we can certainly minimize as best we can the repercussions of it. So I guess I hope it's, when we come out of this, we have opportunity for better dialogue, better decisions, better realizing we're all in this together. I'm curious with the book, Katrina. Again, I love, kind of going through the chapters and just, I look at myself I think of myself as a scholar educator. And for our listeners, in the spirit of full disclosure, I went to Fielding Graduate University back in 2008 to 10. And that's where I got my leadership degree and my master's in leadership and development and my coach training. So I have a special place in my heart for Fielding. And I love the distance learning aspect because it provided me I was on the road all the time. So distance learning provided me the perfect venue to go back to school and to retool myself and to make my pivot. And what I love about what we're going through right now is that, universities like Fielding, or that have distance learning programs, that it opens up education to many people who may not have thought they can go to school. And I'm curious, universities like Fielding, some of your peers that contributed to the book. Do you have a sense that there's opportunities for them and Fielding to contribute, to businesses who want to provide more education to their employees? Maybe they can't afford to go to school, but then Fielding can come in and deliver a class like on dialogue, decision making. What is your sense there?
Yeah, absolutely. To start with the end, the last part of your question, it's definitely the case that Fielding, we now do a lot more what I'd call mini programs or customized. They're not even necessarily programs so much as they are trainings. And as we move into more virtual spaces, as everyone's gotten more comfortable, as you know, Fielding has been in virtual, we call it distributed learning business for over 45 years, but we also have in-person opportunities for events. So as a hybrid, we're very comfortable with virtual learning and what that takes to learn virtually. So I think what an exciting time for Fielding is exactly what you just said. So we do have courses in World Cafe, which is a large-scale model. It's a model for large-scale dialogue on hot topics, on hot controversial topics, the kinds of things that get people very emotional. And that's a really good training program. And yeah, anything can be adapted for an organization or a company. We're finding, for instance, you mentioned the STEM professions before, science, technology, engineering, and math. I was curious that you mentioned it because, as it turns out, Fielding has a National Science Foundation funded project to teach developmental, leadership development skills, mentoring, the kinds of things that we're just talking about that are also important in democracy, to teach that for people in the STEM professions. So for those that may have focused almost exclusively in their particular content area, there are opportunities to continue learning over your lifetime, and these skills will help you in other ways. And so that's an example of how we've taken our own model and our own content, because you were in the Human Organization Development Program at Fielding, and actually say, what can we do to teach and teach others in a different way that isn't a full-scale doctorate. And I think that's important as scholar practitioners and as people who believe in the importance of knowledge in the world.
If we leave this podcast today, we'll leave it today. I'm curious, what has been the reaction to the book and to what you and your peers have produced and about, the future of education and our democracy? What are you hearing from either the students or, somebody? You never know who's going to read a book and find it. We're going to put a link to the book on Amazon. Hopefully we'll sell a copy. What have you been hearing, or what have your peers been hearing about this book and what it's providing, and kind of perhaps some ideas for the future?
Yes, good. We're certainly hearing across higher ed, and particularly a number of national associations have been very interested in having us go to their conferences or run a virtual conversation on some of the topics in the book. So we're getting a lot of interest there. So American Council on Education, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and there's a number of them that operate out of D.C. We did a presentation of the book at the National Press Club in D.C. last year. So that's been very positive, and it's mostly been received, I would say, very well. I think there's some good constructive critique also from college presidents, from not necessarily from college presidents, but more along the lines of from other educators saying, okay, this is great, but how do I actually make it happen? How do we get from the concepts that maybe a particular president uses on a campus with their faculty, and how do I initiate this in my own campus, or how do I get the faculty really excited about the work that doesn't feel prescriptive or, sort of a top-down, you do this. And then in the other sense, also, well, we can get some of our students engaged. How do we make that more widespread, right? How do we build that up in such a way that it doesn't get reduced to, well, I voted, that's enough, or I did a volunteer project and that's enough? How do we really make it more real and more integrated into a student's experience over their college career? So I think there's a lot of good, it sparked a lot of good conversation. And I think that's been gratifying to see. Some actual college, particularly community college districts, have actually taken it on and ordered it for all of their teachers and a number of their classrooms. So we're seeing more and more uptake there. It's about to come out in paperback a little later this year. It would have come out earlier, but COVID-19 postponed that process. But I think once it comes out in paperback, because we wrote it in a sense for it to be enduring, and that it has a very, very long shelf life. A good academic book should. And even though it's a snapshot, it should endure for many decades is our hope. And I think there's another piece, though. I mentioned before, we have to consider that globalization continues to unfold across the next decade, as does the acceleration of technological innovation. So the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of big data, how we think about it, how we analyze it, how we marshal it to make decisions. This is going to be more and more in front of us. The other piece that I mentioned in the chapter that I think you can see playing out in the pandemic, this is another reason why this book is so enduring, is economic inequality, is the wage stagnation since the 1970s in this country, the continuing divide between, say, those that have a college degree and those that don't, and how that's playing out in terms of who gets what jobs. And it plays out racially, plays out in class, plays out in economics, and that these things come to the fore. What the pandemic is showing us is that people who don't have as much suffer more, right? And that there's a big divide in America. And what's an interesting thing is you asked before about how may this pandemic change us. And one of the things I'm hoping it will do is it will reveal to us how we may be divided by economic circumstance, by race, and so on, and by where we live and all of that. But you know what? We need to survive by taking care of each other. I think it's a very curious thing that the way to be safe in a pandemic is to do right by the community, right? Isolate, protect yourself so you protect others. I think that's a great lesson to learn, and I really hope we learn it.
Fantastic. And most definitely that. I mean, that, we have a segment in our podcast. We call it an insight to go. And I was going to ask you for an insight to go. What would you like to leave our audience? And I still would love to have that if you want to share. But what you did just share, I thought was very important. There's an opportunity for us in the community to take care not only of ourselves, but others in the community. So we all come out of this, hopefully better. So, Katrina, I still do want to offer, is there some final thought, a quote, something you'd like to share with our audience, a recommendation as we kind of bring this podcast to the close?
In the last part of the book, we talk about 10 recommendations, concrete things you can do. And I think, I know the publisher is interested in doing another volume. And I think in the next volume, we'd like to see, well, how could this be applied across other kinds of organizations and companies and nonprofits? What are the ways in to get people to be thinking about voice and opportunity as it relates to promoting democratic values? Because I think when we come back to what is democracy with a small d, what we find is that we do have a common agreement around our values. And if we can have those kinds of conversations, I think we will create the world that we all want to live in.
Fantastic. Katrina, before we head out, if our listeners would like to learn more about you, your work, the book, where are the best places for them to go?
Yes, well, Fielding has a website, and there's a link to the Office of the President if you want to learn more about Fielding Graduate University. Thank you. Also, great way, I'm always happy to link in with people on LinkedIn, and would love it if people would know about my LinkedIn address. There's a Facebook for Fielding as well. And I hope that everyone takes a look at the book, which of course can be found on Amazon.
Fantastic. And we'll most certainly provide links back to the Fielding website, as well as to your LinkedIn profile and to the book page on Amazon. So I truly appreciate you taking time out of what I know is a very busy day to join us on the podcast, and really phenomenal dialogue and conversation. And I know I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. And I truly appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Howard. I'm always pleased to speak with a Fielding graduate. We're very proud of the work you do as well.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, there you have it. We have just been chatting with Dr. Katrina Rogers. She's the president of Fielding Graduate University, and she is the co-editor and one of 20 plus contributing authors of the book, Democracy, Civic Engagement, and Citizenship in Higher Education, Reclaiming Our Civic Purpose. And I hope you all found this conversation insightful. I guess that's one of the reasons why we call it the Success Insight Podcast, is we're looking to have those splashes of insight, those light bulbs going off, the pop, 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 and some new way of thinking and a new way of having a conversation. Do go out to the Amazon page. We'll provide a link and check out the book. If you're interested in distributed learning and virtual, Fielding Graduate University, I will gladly talk night and day about Fielding. It was a wonderful experience. We'd also love your feedback on this podcast episode, so please visit us on successinsightpodcast.com. This episode, or any other episode for that matter, you can find us on our Success Insight podcast pages on Facebook, LinkedIn. We are on Twitter. We're even on Pinterest. That's more for the children's book authors. But hey, wherever you can find us, on platforms as well, like Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. So lots of places for you to take advantage of the great conversations we're having here. And as we say after every podcast, or at the end of every podcast, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a safe day, have a great time with your friends, your family, do it at a distance, but wherever you are, make sure it's a phenomenal day as well. We'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.